All right, are we ready, Stu?
You're good to go.
Okay. I'm Deborah Whitman Allen, and welcome everyone. I understand that the goal of this series is to get to know ADATH members on a more intimate level, but I'm pretty sure that was the exact opposite of my mother's intentions when she asked me to moderate tonight. For those of you who know my mother, I think you will understand that given the choice between pleasing the hundreds of people on tonight's Zoom and meeting the goals set for tonight's Zoom and keeping my mother happy, it's not really a very close call. That said, since many of you know my father in his professional capacity, I wanted to introduce him the way I know him, as my dad. As many of you know, my father loves to cook. And one of my earliest memories is my father teaching me how to make omelets on Sunday mornings when I was 6 years old. Now that I have my own child, who's just about that age, that seems to be very, very dangerous. But I don't recall any catastrophes at the time, other than perhaps that the butter wasn't of high enough quality, which, if you know my father, is a real catastrophe. My father has always been the master planner of our family vacations. His itineraries were always very thoroughly researched. They were detailed, and they were only just slightly unrealistic for 4 moderately well-behaved children. See, for example, the Modern Art Museum in Switzerland that did not really go over so well. But although my father is famous for saying that family vacations are meant to be remembered and not enjoyed, I know that for him, along with the rest of us, those trips are among our top family highlights. You may not know this, but my father taught all 4 of us children how to drive, some more successfully than others. He also managed to convince all of us that his car had a tracker that told him not just where we were going, but how fast we were going. And we really did believe him. But despite all of those efforts, when I got in a car accident in the parking lot of IGA on Erev Shabbat, right after we had moved to Montreal, my father was there in minutes to bail me out. He diffused the understandably very, very irate woman whose car I had hit. And by the time we were done, not only had all been forgiven, but I'm pretty sure she had signed up for a membership at the ADATH. Most importantly, my father taught us, and he continues to teach us, how to be a good person. And growing up and today, this was the value he really stressed above all others to all of us in our family. But most importantly, he taught us this by example. I don't know anybody else, anyone, whose life is so dedicated to doing the right thing for himself, for his family, and for the Jewish community. Wherever I go, in every facet of my life, I meet people whose lives have been touched and enriched by my father, and I'm constantly asked, are you Rabbi Whitman's daughter? And I am always proud to say that I am. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to tonight's speaker, my dad.
Devorah, thank you very much. This whole evening was worth it just for that. Socrates sees that people are not listening to his lecture. So he says, I'll tell you a story. A man was walking with a mule in the hot sun, and he sits in the shade of the mule to cool himself. But the owner of the land comes and says, I should sit in the shade of the mule. It's my land. The other one says, but it's my mule. People are waiting to hear the conclusion. And Socrates says, see, you're more interested in the shade of a mule than in the subject of my lecture. My grandfather used to tell that story if he thought his audience wasn't listening. But that was rare. He was a riveting speaker, an extraordinary storyteller with a wonderful sense of humor. He used to tell the story of an old couple, married some 50 years, who were rocking on their front porch as the day grew to a close. Unfortunately, they were both a bit hard of hearing. And the wife said, "Honey, I'm proud of you." He said, "Well, I'm tired of you too." Rose and Sam Margolin, our grandparents. We called our grandfather Grandpa. We called our grandmother Skip because Grandpa would say she was the skipper of the ship, the skipper of our family. My grandfather was born in Memphis, Tennessee in 1910. He practiced law and founded a law school that is now University of Memphis Law School. He was a successful businessman. He was a founder of Memphis Hebrew Academy, now named Margolin Hebrew Academy. And he spoke on behalf of Jewish day schools across America. He was famous. He was admired. And he was ours. He and Skip devoted themselves to their family, especially to us, his grandchildren, with uncommon effort and forethought and fun. And that's what it takes to be a memorable grandparent. Huge amounts of time, attention, planning, and fun. It doesn't happen by itself. It takes deep and creative thinking about how to create memories that last a lifetime and beyond. Our grandparents took us on trips, each time with different groups of grandchildren. This photo is from a trip to Europe with the 4 oldest grandchildren. I am the 3rd oldest, sitting in front. There was an earlier trip to Israel. I missed the cutoff age, which disappointed me deeply. So my grandparents took me on a consolation trip, an overnight train trip to Kansas City, which my grandfather called and was thereafter known in our family as Kansas City, Israel. My grandfather entertained us constantly with jokes and stories and life lessons. He had an invisible friend, Elmer the chicken, about whom he told us stories throughout our childhood. My grandfather loved to sing and loved for all of us to sing at the Shabbos table. I remember a trip to Venice. We were all in a gondola, moving through the canals, loudly singing his favorite Shabbos songs. And he had classic lines, classic retorts, often repeated. For example, if we were spending the night, which was a great treat for us, he would eventually tell us it was time for bed. We would complain, "Grandpa, why do we have to go to bed?" And he would say, "Well, that's really 2 questions. Your first question is why. Why is the question of the philosophers. From the beginning of time, man has pondered why. How can I answer such a question? Your second question is, do you have to go to bed? And the answer is yes. My grandfather taught us to play golf. He loved golf and he was good at it. I loved golf and I loved playing with him, which I did as often as I could. He taught me the skills and he taught me the etiquette of golf. Like in every area of life, he taught me what to do and how to act. Many years later, I had trouble understanding a famous pasuk in the Torah, the second verse at the beginning of the Torah. Ruach Elokim merafefes al pnei hamayim. The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water in the world he had just created. What is merafefes? What does it mean that God was hovering? And this is a critical question because this verse is describing how God is connected to this world. We don't see God. What is the nature of God's presence? What exactly is God's immanence in the world? What is the nature of merafefes? It is a mystery we have grappled with since the beginning of time. And I remembered as a very young boy, my grandfather teaching me how to hold a putter. He told me, hold it like you would hold a bird, firm enough that it doesn't fly away, but loose enough that it is not crushed. And that I later realized is the perfect metaphor to understand merafefes, God's presence in our lives, hovering, present, but in the background, close enough to be aware, but leaving us plenty of room for our own independence. As always, what I learned from my grandfather had multiple levels of meaning and deeper significance as I grew older. This is the photo of my grandparents and their grandchildren. It was taken in our home. Yes, that is me behind my grandmother wearing a light blue three-piece suit. Around the time I was born, my grandparents became Shomer Shabbos, but their home was too far to walk to shul. And all of their children and grandchildren lived in a completely different neighborhood. So they bought a second home, the Shabbos house, 2 blocks from the synagogue. And every Shabbos and Yom Tov, they and our entire extended family moved in. As a child, I spent every Shabbos and holiday with my grandparents, my immediate family, my 3 aunts and uncles, and all their children together in the Shabbos house. It was more work than we ever realized to cook and clean and find places for everyone to sleep, beds, sofas, the floor, and to keep everyone entertained and relatively calm most of the time. It was a solution to a logical problem, but it was also a brilliant, complicated plan that my grandparents realized was worth whatever effort it took, because they created a unique, unforgettable environment for their extended family and a unique, unforgettable relationship between grandparents and grandchildren. A father bird and his 3 fledglings found themselves threatened by a great flood that covered the land. There was time but to save only one of the fledglings, and the father selected the oldest, placed him upon his back, and set out for safety. On the way, he asked, "If our position were reversed, would you do the same for me?" "Certainly," said the child. "I would do anything to save you." Father Bird said, "My child is a fool." And he tipped his wings and allowed the fledgling to fall into the water. When he returned for the second fledgling and asked the same question, he was again told, how could you doubt my gratitude and my loyalty? Of course I would do the same for you. He too is a fool. And the father bird again tipped his wings and then returned for the youngest. "Would you do the same for me?" he asked. The youngest child said, "I don't know, Father. I would hope that I would. But of this I am sure. I would do the same for my children as you have done for me." Father Bird smiled proudly and bore his fledgling to safety. I remember as a child hearing my mother and her sisters, my aunts, saying, "Daddy, please tell us the story of the father bird again." And he would tell the story again, and they would all cry. And they would assure him they would never do that to him. My mother is second from the left in black hair. These are my grandparents' 4 daughters. Starting from the left, my Aunt Jerry, my mother, my Aunt Elaine of blessed memory, and my Aunt Sylvia. What I see now, that story was, in a sense, my grandfather's legacy to teach us how to live authentically, how to raise our family, how to make our lives count. And that is what he lived for. I must add here, my grandfather was a stickler about grammar and hated dangling prepositions like the one I just used. And when he heard something like that, he would say, "That is something up with which I shall not put." Here's another story he told often. In earlier days, leadership was determined by feats of physical strength. And thus did one tribe select its chief by anointing he who climbed highest up a nearby unconquered mountain between sunrise and sunset, and in proof of the extent of his ascent, brought a token for all to see. Once there were 3 to accept such a challenge. The first returned and brought with him nuggets of purest gold, which he had found in the clear waters of a stream high upon the slope. The second climbed higher still and brought back a fragile flower plucked from a sheltered glen. Just as the sun was setting, the third stumbled wearily into the camp. How far did you climb? He was asked. I reached the top. And what token have you brought? I bring a vision of the blue waters of the ocean, miles away. My grandfather was that man of vision. And he was teaching us we too need to develop that visionary leadership, which sees beyond just the material and the transient. My grandfather also made it clear to us how much he benefited from us, his grandchildren. Not just his pride in our accomplishments, which was evident, but what he gained, what we added to his life. He often quoted the passage in the Talmud, whoever teaches Torah to his grandchildren is accounted as if he received Torah personally at Sinai. And he would comment, the passage is ambiguous. It could mean that when grandchildren learn Torah from their grandparents and they become aware that the mandates of the Torah have been handed down in an unbroken chain for 3 generations, they, the grandchildren, will realize that this chain, their connection to the Torah, extends all the way back to Sinai. But he would add, from my experience, it is the grandparents who receive a new sense of dedication and commitment as if they, the grandparents, had been at Sinai when they teach Torah to their grandchildren. Certainly, both interpretations are correct. And my grandfather taught us Torah wisdom in every possible form throughout his life. Many times, he told us about a young student who said to his master, "Master, teach me wisdom." "Very well, my son, listen." "I am listening. Please proceed." "There is nothing more to add, my son." This is the 2 of us when I was in college. As I got older, our relationship did not only continue, it deepened. We wrote letters to each other, cards to each other. This is a card that I got from my grandfather on my birthday one year. Dearest Michael, come into my garden. I want my flowers to see you. Many happy returns. Skip and Grandpa. My grandfather was a reliable presence in our life, always available, always interested. This is another story he would tell to many audiences. And it's a story that also describes what he was in our lives. A man once applied for a job on a farm in the Midwest. When he was asked about his qualifications, he replied simply, "I can sleep when the wind is blowing." In spite of this puzzling and somewhat unresponsive reply, he got the job. A while later, a sudden, powerful storm struck in the middle of the night, and the owner went out to find his worker to help avoid a potential disaster. He found his worker fast asleep, refusing to get up. "I told you I can sleep when the wind is blowing." The angry employer stormed out to do what he could to save his farm, but he found the livestock safely in the barn, the hay stacked in the loft, and the equipment covered and secure. And he then understood, with a new appreciation and respect for his worker, what it meant to be able to sleep even when the wind is blowing. I was so proud to have my grandfather present and as our guest speaker when I was installed in my first rabbinic position in New Orleans, Louisiana. And that is the photo that you see. I remember once I was having a serious problem in my late 20s. I called him to discuss it. And he told me this story. A child is working on a school project and he can't get it to work. His father tells him to keep trying. Finally, the son says he has tried everything and it still won't work. And the father says, "There is one thing you haven't yet tried. You haven't asked me for help." And so I did. I have only touched the surface. There is so much more to tell. But I will conclude with this. That's me at my bar mitzvah. My grandfather spoke at my bar mitzvah. We always wanted him to speak at every family occasion. He established the practice, which I follow, that at a significant occasion, his speech would be in the form of a letter. And in this way, he crafted a well thought out message targeted to each of us that we could keep and reflect on throughout our lives. I certainly have. My bar mitzvah parsha is the Eschanan, which begins with Moshe begging God to be allowed to enter the land of Israel. God had earlier told Moshe that he would not be allowed to enter. But at the end of his life, Moshe begs once more for God to change his mind. And God refuses. Vayomer Hashem Elai Ravla Al Tosef Daber Elai Od Badavar Hazer. What you have already accomplished, Moshe, should be enough for you. God says, don't ask me about this again. Ravla, God says to Moshe, be satisfied. It should be enough for you. The careful listener will remember almost the same words spoken by Moshe just a few parshios earlier when Korach rebels against Moshe, demanding a higher position for himself. And Moshe says to Korach and his followers, Rav lachem b'nei Levi, you seek too much. Be satisfied. Your current status should be enough for you. Now, of course, Korach is wrong. But what Moshe should have said is, God is the one who decides who should have which position of leadership. Don't argue with God. But instead, Moshe said to Korach, be satisfied with what you have accomplished. Be satisfied with how close you are to God. You don't need to go any further. God found fault with Moshe's words. You should never ask someone to be satisfied with what they have accomplished. You should never tell someone they needn't go any further. And God found a subtle way to rebuke Moshe for that when Moshe asked for more. Ravlach Moshe, what you have done is enough. Be satisfied. You won't go any further. You won't enter Israel. This is the basis for part of what my grandfather wrote to me and spoke at my bar mitzvah. Dear Michael, I have been thinking about this moment for a long time. Ours has been a singularly intimate relationship. I want so much to find the right words to speak to you, Michael, and about you. Words that you will understand, or if failing fully to understand them now, words that one day will come to mind. And you will remember this, my grandfather said to me. Throughout life, Michael, you will find a defender of mediocrity, rationalizing his own failures and trying to recruit others to join his company. In one way or another, you will be told, Ravlach, let it suffice you. Be content with things as they are. The words will sound reasonable. You're doing well enough. So what if you're not the best in the group? The highest level of learning or achieving is for the gifted few. That's not for you. There's no law you have to be first or best or the exception, and particularly with your religious commitments, you will be questioned. It's well enough to be observant, but you're far ahead of the average layman. And after all, you're not a rabbi. Never believe it, Michael. Your only limits are your own dreams. No one, not even you, has the right to ask you to compromise with your principles, to moderate your goals, or to expect or accept less than the best. Be blessed, Michael. Be greatly blessed. And may you be a blessing to all those whose lives you touch. Signed, Grandpa. This is perhaps the greatest gift my grandfather gave me and all his grandchildren. His absolute confidence in our success. Even if we sometimes did not have it, we knew with certainty he did. My grandfather used to say, what is the most beautiful sight in the world? The sight of a child walking confidently down the road after you have shown him the way. That is the beauty of my grandfather's life. Permit me, please, to add just a brief postscript. When I agreed to do this, I thought it would be easy to prepare. I know all the stories by heart. It was actually more difficult than I ever imagined it would be. It took me great effort, long, unsettled hours to sift and distill and choose what and how to present my grandfather to you. And it took me back to those years, making this a very emotional exercise for me. I am grateful to every one of you for giving me the opportunity to revisit, to relive some of the most meaningful and important parts of my life. And I am deeply grateful to every member of my family who is joining us. Through preparing this, I have been thinking about every one of you. And in doing so, I am reminded more forcefully than ever that though we are physically distant from each other, we are more closely connected and intertwined than I will ever be able to express. I love you. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you, Dad. I will be moderating the Q&A. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask my dad, please put them in the chat. And we will start with some of the questions that were submitted in advance of tonight. The first question was submitted anonymously, and the question is, which is your favorite child? Okay, joking. You don't have to answer that one. The actual question is, what do you think inspired your grandfather to become more religious later in life?
I think it was when he had the opportunity to start Memphis Hebrew Academy. He did that at a time when day school education in North America was not popular. He and a very small group of people faced opposition, derision at the idea of day school education. But once he had his own child, his youngest child, my Aunt Jerry, and then beginning with his grandchildren in the school, he learned from them. So that idea that I quoted before of what grandparents get from teaching Torah to their grandchildren, I think that's something that he experienced in his own life. And really, in his middle age, he really became a new person, a different person, with his connection to the day school and with his connection to his grandchildren.
Is there a specific holiday that you remember or that stands out in your mind as especially memorable that you would celebrate with your grandparents?
First, it's just incredible. Every holiday was spent with my grandparents. Every holiday, every Shabbos. I never once heard my father, of blessed memory, I never heard him make Kiddush. I never attended a Seder that my father led because my grandfather always did it. Pesach was amazing. The food was nonstop. Sukkot was incredible. We had this gigantic sukkah outside, and I know that Memphis is in the south, but my recollection as a child is that it was absolutely freezing in Memphis on Sukkot. And I remember running around outside the sukkah while the meal was going on with my cousins. Simchas Torah was something very, very special. On Rosh Hashanah, yes, of course, shul was important. Yes, yes. But in the afternoon of Rosh Hashanah was an even more important event, the Rosh Hashanah Bowl, which was an annual football game that took place in the yard next to the shul that everyone in the community participated in. And by the way, it's not only my grandfather and his family were all together, but his two brothers, my Uncle Benny, of blessed memory, my Uncle Joe, of blessed memory, and their children and their grandchildren were also present within a couple of block radius. So just imagine every single Shabbos and Yom Tov being able to visit and play with every single one of not only my siblings, my parents, my grandparents, my first cousins, my third cousins, every single Shabbos. It was an incredible childhood.
Okay, so a couple of questions that came in from the chat, I'm going to consolidate them into one, essentially about growing up in Memphis. So first of all, where did your grandparents' parents come from? And what was it like to grow up Jewish in Memphis? And are parts of your family still living in Memphis?
My grandfather was born in Memphis. My grandmother, Skip, was born in a small town in Florida. Both of them, their families had originated in Lithuania. My grandfather, born in Memphis, his father died when he was very young. And he grew up very poor. His mother took in boarders, he sold newspapers on a street corner. And he struggled. When he passed the bar, he was one of the youngest people ever to pass the bar. The law school that he started grew out of his efforts to tutor other students who were studying for the bar, but they didn't have the means to afford expensive teachers. And out of that grew his desire to start a law school at night. He was practicing law during the day, and he started the school at night, and it was specifically designed as a law school for people who would not have been able to afford to go to school full time. I remember as a child, we always had dinner at 5:30. 5:30 dinner every night. And I wanted to ask my mother, why do we have dinner at 5:30? I had friends, they had dinner at 6 or at 6:30 or at 7. Some people even had dinner at different times on different nights. And she told me, well, when I was growing up, we always had dinner at 5:30 because Daddy, her father, my grandfather, had to leave home to teach because he taught every night at law school. So they had dinner at 5:30. So we had dinner at 5:30. I never experienced any type of anti-Semitism growing up in Memphis. It's a very, very religious community. It's said there are more churches per capita in Memphis than anywhere else. We lived in a predominantly Jewish area in East Memphis. It was very pleasant. It was very safe. It was a great place to grow up. For a variety of reasons, most of my family has moved away. I have second and third cousins and further extended family that are still in Memphis. But my closest family is now, most of us are in Israel, the second largest number in the New York metropolitan area, some in New Jersey, some in Florida, a few other places.
Okay, next question. Do you think it was fair that the older grandchildren got to go on much better trips than the younger grandchildren?
Well, I don't think that that's true. I think that different grandchildren went at different times. I can tell you that I'll just say this, that is just not factually true. If one compares, and you know, we once took a trip to Israel when I did make it to Israel with my grandparents, and we took a boat, a ship home. It was not like the ship that some of my cousins took when they went. So there was some amount of competition among grandchildren, as there always would. We lived at different times. We experienced different things. One thing about my grandfather and trips is that he really did make an effort that whatever happened, and things would go wrong, to make it into an adventure. And I remember very clearly, we were on a trip to England, and we were driving through the countryside, which was absolutely gorgeous. And the car broke down. And this is before cell phones or any kind of communication. The car broke down, and we were waiting for quite some time for help to arrive. And the car broke down next to a pasture, and there were cows. And I don't know how he did it, but somehow he just arranged the most marvelous adventure of spending time playing with these cows while we waited for our car to be towed. And in fact, the exact same thing happened to us when we took our children on a trip, not in the same location, but the same thing happened. The car broke down. And we were on the side of the road.
Also insist that he could drive a stick shift when he couldn't?
I can drive a stick shift, and the car was broken. But in any event, I remembered, and we had quite an adventure with the cows on the side of the road waiting for help to come.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. So do you have any particular memories about the farm?
So my grandparents, again, it just brilliantly thought out planning of ways to keep our family connected and together. So my grandfather, along with his 2 brothers, so this is the larger family, they bought a farm. And it was, let's say, an hour outside of Memphis, maybe a 45-minute drive from our home. And the farm had horses. All of us had horses, which we learned to ride. My grandfather enjoyed Tennessee walking horses, which he kept and rode. We had a family that lived on the farm that did the actual hard work of the farm. We planted corn, watermelon, which my grandfather loved, a couple of other vegetables. In the summer, we would go out on Sunday and pick some things and bring them home. My grandmother would cook them for dinner. It was incredible. There was also a swimming pool. So in the summer, all of us, all of the cousins, we would have swimming lessons and horseback riding lessons. It was kind of a summer camp. There was a 3-hole golf course for my grandfather. And it was amazing fun. It was just incredible. And it was a way that really kept us together and built our relationships. I remember in particular one birthday that Judy and I shared. My cousin Judy Katz and I, we share a birthday. She's 1 year younger. And we had many birthdays together. And I remember sharing a birthday cake and a birthday party together at the farm. But we had so many memories. They did these things to intentionally help us create these memories. And they were successful. None of us will ever forget this.
Okay, so this question is from Mom. I'm not sure if she's projecting, but I'll just read the question. Did your grandfather encourage you to become a rabbi?
No. He, like my parents and like me, assumed that I would become a lawyer, which was what my plan was. My father was a lawyer. My grandfather was a lawyer. Most of the men in my family were lawyers. That was the plan. And I deviated from that plan. He was very supportive, as were my parents. He did have occasion to quote back to me quite a number of times that letter from my bar mitzvah, which he always got a kick of, having been prescient about. I would not say that he encouraged me, but I would say he definitely supported me and appreciated it and was very proud. And he was extremely proud of every single grandchild that went in all sorts of different directions. Let me take myself out of this for a moment. But if you look at our wider family, it's an incredible family. The type of people, the character, the accomplishments, the width and breadth of this amazing family, again, taking me out of it. And he encouraged every one of us.
Okay, so the last question, which is submitted anonymously, is can we have a rendition of Yismachu Hashamayim? Just reading the questions.
Yismachu Hashamayim, Yismachu Hashamayim, Yismachu Hashamayim, V'sagel haaretz. Let me do one other thing. let me sing for you my grandfather's favorite song that we sang in Venice on the gondola. Eilecha Hashem ekra Ve'el Hashem la 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 la. You love that. My friends, thank you very much. Is that it, Tavara? Anything else?
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, sure.
This is a very good one. So your grandfather was clearly a very articulate person. Was he a my way or the highway type of guy? Did other members of the family feel they had space to express themselves and disagree with him?
A little of both. And also it depended at what time in his life. I remember one of the golfing trips that he took several grandchildren on. It was actually to a place in Arkansas that we went a couple of times. And it happened at the time that Richard Nixon was going down in flames. And my grandfather supported Richard Nixon and thought that he was being unfairly attacked. And we, the grandchildren who were there, who at that time were aware and following the news, we were very much against Nixon. And we were a bit merciless in our disagreement with my grandfather about politics. So there were lively discussions. Yes, we were able to express different opinions. He did think that ultimately he knew best, but he did respect differences that existed in our family to a certain extent.
Right. Thank you, Dad.
Thank you, Devara. You were so much more gentle on me than I was worried.
Yeah. Don't count on it next time.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Stu Gutman. Thank you to everyone for joining.